Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome. This is Jennifer Reynolds, your host of Jennifer's Journeys. It is the last week in the month of April in 2020, and we're continuing to do our armchair travels. Our sessions are recorded and they're available on Jennifer Reynolds Travels, both on YouTube as well as on Facebook. And by way of a quick introduction again, for some of you that may be new, my name is Jennifer Reynolds. I was born and raised in Canada. I have a deep, deep love of history, geography, of travel. I spent 18 years of my life living and working on cruise ships, but I was born and raised in Canada. When I worked on ships, I ran the shore excursion department and was part of a duo juggling magic act for several years. But when I was running shore excursions, and you see a photo of me here from the Silver Cloud, I love that photograph and I still have that jacket. I met my husband there on the upper right. His name was Dr. Stuart Nelson, an oceanographer and a historian. Stu was a very popular lecturer, did a tremendous amount of work with Oceania, with Regent. And with him, I developed a very deep love of history and geography and maps. And I really think it's there where I went from a tourist and turned into much more of a traveler. So welcome to Jennifer's Journeys. This last little while, we've had a chance to explore some places together. And I champion the cause of my travel agent partners throughout the world. If it wasn't for our travel agent partners, I don't know what I'd do, because our world is very confusing and it is unclear. And I've been in the travel industry all of my life. I've never worked in anything else, with 18 years on cruise ships. And the one thing I know, that having a good travel pro on your side is one of the things that makes all of the difference. Although in my professional career, I've primarily worked with travel agents in bringing travel to their destinations, to their travelers. And as a result of having done a tremendous amount of travel throughout the world, I've had a chance to experience some pretty incredible places. One of them I had a chance to go to in Eastern Canada, the Maritimes. Growing up in Canada, we would go out west, you went down east. There's a very significant difference in Canada between the eastern and the western part of the country. I worked on some of the first cruise ships ever to sail from New York to Montreal. In fact, Quebec City didn't even have a cruise terminal at that point in time. So I want to go back this week and visit some of my favorite places. We went to Halifax last week on Friday. We have visited the Titanic, and we're going to stay in Maritime Canada by looking at Canada's smallest and greenest province, which is Prince Edward Island. I am unashamedly Canadian. I carry a U.S. passport, but I'll often say to anyone who will listen that maple syrup runs in my system. And Prince Edward Island, which is off the eastern coast of Canada, between the provinces of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Quebec, and Newfoundland, in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And the photograph you look at there is one that is near and dear to my heart. You see the Holland America ship there. And that overhead photograph actually is of my ship, which was of the Silver Cloud when we were tied up on one of our visits to Prince Edward Island. PEI, as we call it in Canada, Prince Edward Island, depends on the land and the sea as a basis for its primary industries, which are agriculture, tourism, and fisheries as well. And certainly tourism is a current economic engine on the island. Some people will come in by cruise ship. Some things historically over the last number of years have made a difference and opened up PEI to tourism. It's a place that many people in Southern Ontario will escape to. I'm in my mid-50s. Many folks I grew up with in Southern Ontario have escaped Toronto and environs and jumped out to PEI to have a quality of life that isn't found anyplace else. So PEI is a really very, very special place. Farming and potatoes account for over 25% of the economy. And the island is now connected to New Brunswick by the Confederation Bridge, which was opened in 1997. I grew up in Southern Ontario. I very clearly remember Prince Edward Island when it was a full-on island. When discussions about the bridge which spans the Northumberland Strait. It's 8 miles long, and it's the longest bridge in the world covering these ice-covered waters. Make no mistake about it. Here in maritime Canada, things in the wintertime can be really brutal. But even as a little girl, I remember this bridge being built and the discussions about it, and the island having only been accessible by ferry, so it took effort to get to the island. And now this 8-mile bridge being long and being built, it was designed to have high durability. It was able to survive very, very severe environmental issues and also supposedly have a 100-year lifespan. Prince Edward Island is called PEI, or the island. Those of us from Ontario, we call Charlottetown or Seatown, is very common. Shocking to think that an island this size has only about 150,000 people living on it. And that's sort of divided between urban and rural developers, or dwellers, I should say. High bilingualism. You're in Eastern Canada over here. About 15% of the population speak both French and English as a bilingual. Know something about Canada, it is a bilingual country. If you ever look at a label of anything coming to the US, you can often figure out very quickly if it was made in Canada. Turn it around. If the label is in French and English, chances are it was made in Canada. In schools, we are all taught French and English. The signs in Canada are in French and English. Yet surprisingly, there is a very small amount of the country that speaks exclusively French. It's a really interesting phenomena, and myself having grown up in Southern Ontario, is really neat to think that 15% here identifies both French and English, and it's a really beautiful quality in Eastern Canada for people to have that bilingual ability to be able to go in and out. But PEI and Charlottetown have a very special place in both the history and the hearts of Canada. Why? Because it's a location where Canada's Confederacy was created, and the island is popularly called the birthplace of Confederation. In the island's capital of Charlottetown, or Seatown, that's where the idea was born for uniting the provinces of Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, under the name of Canada. This beautiful island was successfully named Abgowé, Ile Saint-Jean, and Prince Edward Island. First, Abgowé was for the Micmacs, Ile Saint-Jean was the French influence, and then later Prince Edward Island. And if you were with me a couple days ago when we talked about Halifax, that is one and the same Prince Edward that we're talking about. But the first residents of Prince Edward Island were over 10,000 years ago, way before Christopher Columbus made his landfall in this part of the world, and that was when this part of the world was still connected to the mainland. These Paleo-Indian hunters and foragers, they were called Micmacs, and they led a migratory existence. Abgowé is what they called the island. And the Micmac traveled throughout the region throughout the seasons as food and supplies dictated. 5,000 years ago, the sea levels rose, removing the land bridge and creating an island once again. And before the time of the European arrival, the Micmac of the Atlantic region, the Gaspé Peninsula of what is now Quebec, and parts of Maine were organized into 7 political districts, and Prince Edward Island was one of these districts. The 7 districts made up the Micmac Nation, a union under the leadership of the Grand Council, as you see here. Although inhabited by the Micmac people, the island, as it is often referred to, was first discovered by Europeans when the French voyageur Jacques Cartier explored what would become the maritime provinces in the 1530s. Although the island was discovered by Cartier in 1534, it was probably visited frequently by French and Basque fishermen in the 17th century. Europeans did not settle permanently until the 2nd decade of the 18th century. As part of the French colony of Acadia, and after 1713, the French colony of Ile Royale, the island was called Ile Saint-Jean. The first continuous French settlement on Ile Saint-Jean was begun in 1720 at a place called Port La Joie, or Port Joy, which is today Charlottetown Harbor. The original French settlers were Acadians. The main settlement during the next 2 decades was the fishing port of St. Peter's. And this is St. Peter's, where you to visit Charlottetown and Prince Edward Island today. Back in the 18th century, population for the entire island ranged from about 300 to 450 people. Settlements did not exist more than 1 farm deep from the shoreline anywhere, so there was little need for roads. Travel was mostly by canoe through the Hillsborough River. In 1758, the British captured the French fortress of Louisbourg on the second and final time on Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia. New settlers from Scotland, England, and Ireland began arriving to the former French settlement areas. As a quick aside, I draw your eye to the left and up to the Bay of Fundy as you look towards New Brunswick. Just a quick little aside, the Bay of Fundy has some of the highest tides in the world, up over 50 feet. If you have ever gone into the Bay of Fundy on a cruise ship, it would not be uncommon to have the gangway starting up on the pool deck on the top in the morning, and when you come back at the end of the day, having it embarking down, way down at a deck 3 or a deck 4 level. Really extraordinary what Mother Nature is able to do. But it was 1863, Ile Saint-Jean, which is today Prince Edward Island. It was formally ceded by France to Britain by the Treaty of Paris, and it was renamed to St. John Island. The present name of Prince Edward Island was adopted in 1799 to honor then Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, who, by the way, was the father of Queen Victoria and the younger brother of King George IV. Prince Edward was born on November 2nd, 1767 at Buckingham Palace to King George III. King George III was best known for losing the 13 American colonies during the American Revolution of 1776, and later on in his life he had a very tenuous grip on sanity. But for the Acadians who had their roots in France, conflict escalated because they refused to swear an oath of allegiance to the British king. The situation became so contentious that the British decided to undertake an ethnic cleansing. They rounded up French Acadian settlers on PEI, as well as all of those in other locations now under British rule, and they began deporting them. Most deportees were simply sent by sailing ship to the American colonies and left to fend to themselves, and a few were repatriated to France. A number of Acadians were transported to Louisiana, where today their American descendants bear the corrupted name of Cajuns. Some Acadians managed to escape and make their way to Quebec. On Prince Edward Island, about 300 Acadians had avoided deportation by retreating into the island's interior. Remember, previously, everything had always been along the shore. Many others simply disappeared from sight. Throughout the French settlements, some 8,000 to 10,000 Acadians were deported over a period of 8 years, a very sad time in history. Although a few eventually returned to their burned and ravaged homesteads, most were scattered far and wide. When the first organized British census was taken in 1798, the population of Prince Edward Island was a whopping 4,372. Steady immigration continued for the next 100 years. Think about how young this part of the world is. In only 1891, the population was merely 109,000. But from then on, the population declined. The growth of tourism in Prince Edward Island in the 20th century was one of the major facts of life here. But it was only with increased leisure and greater mobility that the impact of tourism was felt. 1950s, there was one ferry crossing from PEI to the mainland, and there was only a few crossings that were made each day. As a child going down east, I remember planning our schedules so you would pick up the ferry to be able to get over to the island. But there was a limitation to the number of tourists who could get over here until the bridges were built. Once they got onto the island, believe it or not, transportation in the 1950s was limited. Roads were poor, the railroads were slow. And it was a few years after 1907 it was even illegal to drive a car on the island roads. In fact, it was the Prince Edward Island Tourist Association, established in 1919, that led the fight to have roadways opened to cars. PEI, Prince Edward Island, is also known as the Garden on the Gulf for its pastoral landscape. The sand and the soil as you see it is an oxide in the soil. It's an iron oxide throughout the country or throughout the province, and that's what gives it that deep, rich looking color. Charlottetown, the colonial seaport, which is on the capital of Prince Edward Island, we all call it Seatown. It was established in 1765 by Captain Samuel Holland, and it was named for Queen Charlotte, who was the wife of King George III of England. It's an old, well-established town. It's a place where a lot of other Canadians want to go to in the summertime. They desire to have a second place to go to. But the seasons are hard on the place here. Province House is where the historic Confederate took place, and that was in 1864, right at University Avenue. Charlottetown City Hall, the National Historic Site of Canada, was constructed in the 1880s, and Beaconsfield House is a place with great history, named in honor of the Earl of Beaconsfield. The home was built back in 1877 for James Peake. He was a very wealthy shipbuilder and merchant and a very leading citizen. Shipbuilding collapsed in the area. Mr. Peake lost all of his money and lived in the house for a mere 5 years. The new owner was an eccentric and wealthy gentleman by the name of Henry Cundall. He never married, and he lived at Beaconsfield with his 2 sisters. When he died in 1926, he left the house to the town as a refuge for friendless young women. Then in the 1930s, the Cundall Museum became a place for student nurses and those that were studying at the nearby hospital. And finally, in the 1970s, it was turned into the present-day museum. St. Dunstan's Roman Catholic Basilica started construction at the end of the 19th century. Take a look at Victorian Row, collection of Victorian buildings and restaurants, cafes, and galleries. Prince Street and Water Street, Confederation Landing. Seems crazy, but Cow's ice cream is said to be the best in Canada. Look it up online. Renowned from east to west. Nobody touches Prince Edward Island when it comes to seafood. Lobster, mussels, clams, shrimp, salmon, oysters. Doesn't matter how you look at it, you're going to be really well fed. I remember having my uncle growing up within Prince Edward Island, and as a kid he would talk about the rich kids going to school and having bologna sandwiches and the poor kids going to school with lobster sandwiches because the rich kids' parents could afford to go to the grocery store and buy bologna, and the poor parents were able to supply the lobster sandwiches. Interesting how the world is completely turned around. Summer on Prince Edward Island is a really big deal. The beaches are magnificent. The camping is extraordinary. The parks are well managed. And it's not just the people who live here, because after all, there's only 150,000 people that live on the island. But the winters are pretty brutal, and there are a myriad of festivals and ways that we Canadians like to keep busy. I may have moved from Toronto to Florida a long time ago, but I'll take a flat, hot Florida summer over a cold Canadian winter any day. Anna Green Gables is in Cavendish, the Haunted Woods, the Balsam, the Hollow Trail, the cottage where Lucy Maud Montgomery was born, can be found in New London. Anne of Green Gables has become such a popular figure every year. Of course, a musical version of her story is performed at the festival. People come from around the world to get married at Anne of Green Gables, and certainly I think it is possible that Anne of Green Gables may have put Charlottetown and Prince Edward Island on the map. But PEI, Prince Edward Island Seatown, and Cavendish, which is the next largest city, if you will, it is the gentle island. It is our eastern part of Canada. In the summer months, it is an exquisitely beautiful place to go. I shared with you some of my colleagues from Ontario who have retired. This is my girlfriend, Carrie, and the view from her patio in the summer months, and that's a look back to their home in the winter months. So yes, they do have it a little brutal, but PEI has an awful lot going for it. Grab a camper. You can drive over to the island. You can still take the ferry over. Camping, bed and breakfasts, hotels, guided vacations, cruise ships still call into PEI. The fishing is extraordinary. You're in a great jumping off point for other maritime experiences in Eastern Canada, like Newfoundland, and of course into Halifax. But when you're in a spot like Prince Edward Island that does benefit from that slightly moderate summer, but get the heck kicked out of them in the winter months, they do play pretty hard. And one of the things and the festivals in the summer months is the Sand Castle festivals, known around the world. And whether you're being it or camping or staying in local restaurant or staying in local hotels, a lot of farm stays have become popular. Do you know there's a lot of spots you can go here and help and contribute with chores? Families will go up here and come out of cities where they've never had an experience on a farm or with the animals, going horseback riding and kayaking and camping and taking in really the exquisiteness and differentness. That's that eastern part of Canada that's just so very, very different. Prince Edward Island, the Maritimes, tonight. And the last while together, we visited the Galapagos Islands in Ecuador. We've looked at the history of the Panama Canal. We did a partial transit of the canal and looked at Italy, a little bit of Ireland, and thinking of you stand on the cliffs of Moher and stare from here, you look at Newfoundland. South America to Peru, to the Amazon, one of my favorite places in the entire world, which is the Antarctic, and then Tanzania. Wonderful mysteries, the Bermuda Triangle, and a three-part story about the mystery of the Titanic. And now here we are in Canada. And as our last week together and our armchair travels come together, we're going to continue down the St. Lawrence Seaway into the Great Lakes region, right by the place where I grew up on Lake Ontario. I think we'll take a look at some of the new opportunities that exist for cruising in the Great Lakes. Maybe we'll take a look in the U.S. at the Mississippi River. Some wonderful close to home opportunities that exist as we travel, as we armchair travel. And this is our last week, Wednesday, and finally Friday evening this week. Same time, same link. And know that you can always catch our content on Jennifer Reynolds Travels, both on Facebook and on YouTube. To travel is to live, and to live is to travel. My name is Jennifer Reynolds. Thank you so much for joining me for all of our armchair journeys. Hashtag travel strong, my friends. And thank you for joining me.